Is it something that they do purposely, and like analytically, or is it something that they just feel that it organically they felt it was right to do, to change, to displace them?
Well, I think that we have a system that does the displacement without any kind of plan or conspiracy.
Right.
That
it's more the mathematics.
This economic model creates armies of surplus people who are simply not needed for this economic model, or are needed for cheap labor, but not in as the numbers that they're in. So it keeps wages very, very low. But there's definitely a very keen understanding that it is much better to work with migrant workers, with workers who are precarious. I mean, that's the key point. And I remember being in New Orleans days after the levees broke, and I interviewed a high-up official in the state government in Baton Rouge, in the state legislature of Louisiana. And I was asking him whether the people who had lost their homes, who were in their shelters at that point, mostly African Americans, overwhelmingly African Americans, were going to get jobs rebuilding New Orleans. Seemed like a straightforward question, and of course this was on my mind because I had seen it not happen in Iraq, and I had seen it, and the preference for migrant labor in Iraq, and the preference for migrant labor even in the tsunami-affected areas. And he said, well, no, I think, he said, in the South we have a migrant workforce, and I think that probably that's who's going to rebuild New Orleans, and so it's not that there's a sense that people from Guatemala are not good organizers, because of course people from Guatemala are great organizers in many cases, but it's that people from Guatemala and New Orleans are in a state of constant precariousness. And that precariousness makes them much easier to exploit.
And do you think that for want of a better term, the corporate powers, do you think they're aware of the power of, for example, the indigenous sense of place and the indigenous sense of story?
Well,
do you think they perceive them as the other or an enemy, or I mean, certainly in terms of access to natural resources?
Yeah, well, I think more and more we're seeing indigenous organizing articulated as a quasi-terrorist threat, and even having the framework of the war on terror applied to indigenous movements. And it started, well, it didn't start, I mean, this has been a very long story, but I mean, it happened with the Zapatistas, and now there's there's certainly a discourse in Latin America around the threat of indigenism, and in Canada we're seeing this because it's intimately connected to natural resources, and the fact that we're in this moment where we can clearly see that we have this sort of last holdouts to this logic. At the same time, the earth has been pretty successfully plundered of its wealth, but not completely. And the places where there's still oil left to be extracted and still gold left to be extracted tend to be the remotest parts of the world, because it's therefore the most expensive to do the resource extraction. So we're at a really crucial moment here, because everywhere I've been traveling a lot recently in Latin America, and hearing again and again that the push is on, because the price of oil is so high. The price of all the commodities is through the roof. And so you have, it's really like a final colonial pillage is underway, and a fight is on, and the discourse of war to cast the indigenous people as terrorists is really in full swing.
But they don't call them the indigenous threat, do they? They call it populism. No? They name it. They give other terms to. I mean, they wouldn't dare say the indigenous threat, or have they?
Yeah, they wouldn't use the term like indigenous terrorist like they use Muslim terrorist. they haven't kind of connected the word
But it's kind
terrorist
of-
to indigenous, or do you think
It's
they
at
have?
the early stages. I mean, there have been some sort of policy papers that have come out in the U.S. That are absolutely blurring those lines.
So do you think
And even in Canada, we're seeing this because First Nations people in Canada do use direct action tactics to protect their land. And we have the Olympics and the Winter Olympics in 2010. So you've got two forces which are both, you know, incredible land grabbers. You've got the high price of natural resources, and you've got the Olympics. And really, the only barrier is that actually British Columbia, which is where the Olympics will be, is 80% unceded territory. And as we get closer to the Olympics, we're getting more and more security reports coming out talking about this threat using more violence against First Nations people.